I'm Melina Tsapos, and this is In-Depth Conversations.
Okay. So I'm very excited to introduce our next guest for In-Depth Conversations. It's Lena Halldenius. She is a professor in human rights here at Lund University. She has a background in law, as well as practical philosophy. Her work extends both political philosophy and the history of political thought. So very welcome to the channel, Lena.
Thank you for having me
here. Lena, you've written a number of books, among them this one on liberalism, a very good book, and this one called Mary Wollstonecraft and a feminist I can never pronounce this word.
Republicanism.
Thank you, yes. But the title goes on, Independence, Rights and the Experience of Unfreedom.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, maybe we can start talking a little bit about Mary Wollstonecraft,
yes.
who this book is about, or her work and her thoughts. She was a 18th century thinker and feminist, we would call her today. I
yes,
think.
yeah.
And she has played a very central role in much of your work and your academic research. Maybe you could tell us who don't know so much about Mary Wollstonecraft, why she's so significant, and could you tell us a little bit about her? Maybe?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thanks.
So Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the few women philosophers who sometimes, gets into the margins of the philosophical canon. And I think that's to do with the fact that she wrote quite early about the rights of women. And she is mostly known for her work on that. Her most famous book, or most famous today anyway, you have it here. I see in Swedish translation. It's in the original. It's called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And for women philosophers in the history of thought to get into the philosophical canon, it seems to me that they have to write about women. If they write about women, they can get in because then they sort of represent the woman question, and they can be used as a kind of a token woman in a history of philosophy which is in all other respects overwhelmingly male. So women thinkers can be allowed in if they write about women. Because that's not a threatening question, because it doesn't sort of seep into other things. I might sound cynical when I say that, but I really think that it's true. So my interest, I started to read Mary Wollstonecraft for those same reasons, because as a feminist philosopher, I was interested in excavating the history of feminist thought. So I read A Vindication of the Rights of Women, as everyone does usually, who starts to acquaint themselves with Wollstonecraft's work. But what I found was a political philosopher and a moral philosopher of much wider significance. And also you find out that she wrote a lot of other things that are not specifically about women, but where a theme that runs through everything that she wrote was the project to philosophize or to write philosophy from the perspective of the disadvantaged, from the perspective of those without privilege, and how unfairness and unfreedom looks and feels if you live without privilege. And that is if you're a woman, if you are poor, if you're a slave, if you are marginalized in any other way. How does society appear to you? And what does philosophizing about injustice and unfreedom does? What kind of project is that? If that is your starting point, to philosophize through the experience of living an unprivileged life. And that's why this became so important to me, because that was something that I was interested in trying to do. And I felt that quite a lot of political philosophy didn't do that. It started with the abstract question, what is freedom, or what is justice, rather than starting with the question, what is it like to be at the brunt of unfreedom? And that was my way into her as a philosopher and not only as a feminist thinker.
Very interesting. So what is this? Because you do talk quite a lot about freedom specifically, and what that means. And what is then unfreedom the unfreedom experience that you have here.
So unfreedom, today in our political discourse today, freedom is a concept that is used in several different ways, but I think one predominant understanding of it is that freedom is about being unobstructed, that you have freedom of choice, you have freedom of action, that you live with as few prohibitions as possible. So we sometimes refer to that as freedom as non-interference. So you are free to the extent that you have a sphere around you within which you can act according to your own wishes and your own preferences without being obstructed by somebody else or by law. It is important to understand how new that way of looking at freedom is, and that in the philosophical and political context in which Wollstonecraft is writing, and this is the 1780s, 1790s, this is a period of great political upheaval. She wrote in the wake of the French Revolution, which was an overwhelmingly important event for political thinkers at that time, also for her. And so my book is called Mary Wollstonecraft and Feminist Republicanism, and republicanism is important because republicanism refers to a political tradition of thinking wherein freedom for a person in society to be free is to live not without interference, but to live without having a master. So it's to live without subordination. And the difference between interference and subordination is that interference is if someone actually stops you or actually prohibits you from doing something, maybe either physically or by introducing some kind of cost or risk. Subordination in the Republican sense is to be vulnerable to someone else's arbitrary will. Even if that person or agent doesn't stop you from acting, the fact that you are vulnerable to someone else's power, to someone who could interfere with you, even whether or not they do, that relation itself of being vulnerable to someone else's power, that is what makes you unfree, even if you are, in practical terms, unhindered. And for many of us, this is a bit different to get our head around. So they often use the analogy of the slave in order to explain this. So a slave is the property of someone else. A slave is subordinated to the will of their master. A slave's master can be benign, benevolent, and kind. You know, the slave could be in a situation with a benevolent master that has no interest in constraining the slave very much. But it's still a master-slave relationship, you know. So the slave's practical freedom is dependent on the master's goodwill continuing to be in their favor. And if that shifts, the master cannot do anything about it. Now, that unfreedom of being vulnerable to arbitrary power, that is the cornerstone of that Republican way of thinking. And what that means is that a person can be free only if they live in non-dominating or non-arbitrary relationships. And this traditionally this has been about the organization of political society. So a person cannot be free, for instance, if they live under an authoritarian ruler, say an absolute king, which was the normal at this time. So if you live under an absolute king, no one is free. You know, even if you're a nobleman, even if you are the wealthiest person in society, you are still dependent upon the goodwill of that ruler. And by that fact alone, you are unfree. Now, Wollstonecraft was what I call a feminist Republican, in the sense that she took this Republican way of thinking about freedom as a product of egalitarian relationships rather than non-obstruction, and analyzed the relationships between men and women, between rich and poor, in private society, not only in the civic relationships between citizens and rulers, but in social life generally. And so her feminism is an application of the Republican idea of being free from mastery applied to social relationships, specifically about the relationship between men and women in marriage or in everyday relationships, but also between the dynamics between rich and poor. So being poor is not only about not having economic resources, it is also a humiliating dependence upon the goodwill of the rich. And by that, you are, if you are poor, unfree, because you are without power in relation to those who lord over you. And it's that dynamic, that messy dynamic of social life, of these interlocking, inegalitarian relationships of power. And if we start thinking about unfreedom and injustice in that kind of terrain, rather than from the comfort of our philosophical armchairs asking conceptual questions, that shifts what the project is
really
about.
Means. Yeah, for freedom, unfreedom. Definitely, I agree with you. You've touched on a lot of things there. That was very interesting. So maybe one thing, just if I understood you right, with this master-slave relationship, there's also a law there, right, with the king, and there's other things that reinforce this structure, hierarchical structure. But do you mean that Mary Wollstonecraft, she also took it to a different kind of mastery that's maybe perhaps not bound by law, but could be by social structures?
Yes.
And so it goes beyond just what's lawful.
Yes, yeah. So what is a law and what is a social norm can, in everyday life, matter quite little, and social norms, particularly if she's now writing about the situation of the poor and the situation of women in an 18th century context, what stops women from being free in this context is, of course, the law which says that a married woman is legally subsumed under the authority of her husband. That is a very clear example of the master-slave relationship that I was talking about before. So when the law says that when you marry a man, you are no longer a person in the eyes of civil law. And you cannot sign a contract, you cannot go on a trip, you cannot inherit money. Everything will go through your husband. If you work for wages and earn money, that money will be automatically transferred to your husband, because as a person you don't exist in the eyes of the law. That is unfreedom. But also, if you live in a social context where the norms are such that you are continually told that as a woman you cannot think properly, as a woman you are emotional, as a woman your destiny is to be an obedient and virtuous and dutiful wife and mother, and if you step out of those confines, then you will be socially ostracized. There is no law saying that, but it is a system of social norms that works just as effectively, not only in constraining what people do, but also in how they think about themselves, what is imaginable for them. And if you are told that virtue for you is to be obedient and to please others, to be an ornament rather than a person, then that will affect your whole outlook on what you can be and what you can do and what is right for you. And that is also a kind of unfreedom that you through internalization of social norms also impose upon yourself.
Yeah, but one thing that I think about, like a strong message that I get from Mary Wollstonecraft when I was reading her, she says that we unless, like, if we break away, if we change these laws, which we arguably have a lot today. So today, mostly, maybe we could argue that it's social structures, at least in Sweden, that enforce these hierarchies. But we are capable of breaking free from these chains. Then it's who is holding us back? Then is it then still society, or is it our own? Because she was able to write this book even in the 18th century, which was totally different. And for me, it feels like she really realized, like, education, for example, was such a key thing to really empower yourself. And that, for me, was a strong message. And then that's the way you could help yourself out of these chains. Or how do you see it? Where do you see that the responsibility lies today in a society like today?
Yeah, well, I think that the external and the internal circumstances that hold people back because of social norms and expectations and attitudes, you can't really separate what is external and internal. And I think that is one of the things that she analyzes so interestingly when she says that it's not surprising that women hug their chains when they have for such a long time been told that they cannot be independent. And this kind of habituation to what is normal. And I think that this is a process that we see all around us, not only in terms of social norms holding certain groups back, but also in terms of social norms generally in society, where shifts can happen quite quickly. For instance, in the attitude to immigrants and refugees, in the attitude to what the public sector should do and what the private sector should do. Taken for granted ideas about what is normal can shift very quickly. This process of normalization really has no bottom. We adapt very quickly and something new becomes normal. And that is both an inhibiting factor, but also in a sense where the potential for liberation lies. And I think that for Wollstonecraft it was very clear that it is a personal responsibility, and she sometimes sounds quite harsh here. It is a personal responsibility to try to make yourself free and to develop yourself morally. I mean, she's an Enlightenment thinker and very interested in subjectivity and the malleability of the human individual minds. Yeah. But any responsibility that we put upon a person to change their ways or to develop or to become better or to become more responsible or whatever will always be dependent upon the circumstances in which they live. And this is one thing which is very forcefully articulated in her theory of rights, is that rights and duties and responsibilities have the same foundation. So if we say that a person has rights, and then we will also say that that person has duties, but also vice versa. So if we say that people have duties, for instance, to take responsibility for their own lives, then we are also obligated, by kind of logic, to say that they also have rights. Mm-hmm. Because if the idea, for her it certainly was the case that it was our moral capacities as persons that ground our status as rights holders, but our status as duty holders have the same foundation. So this is, if a person is not granted rights, they can have no duties either, or no responsibilities either. That is a package. And also that we cannot, it's tyranny, she says, it's tyranny to expect of people to fulfill duties if they are not granted the opportunities to do so, or the rights and the dignity that comes with being regarded as a person who has rights. So we cannot expect people to take moral responsibility if we leave them in dire and desperate circumstances. This is all, so all responsibilities in that sense are dependent upon the quality of life that people are granted. Mm.
But so then in a way it becomes invisible. Because if for example, in Sweden today, I mean, we sort of have a socialist society that arguably wants to take care of the poor, or there's some efforts there to have some kind of equality in society, and we have free education for all and such. And then what is it then that makes some women, for example, if we stick to women and men, because there is a lot of injustice, but for simplicity, what makes women still choose certain things and men certain other things in society? And how do we make sense of that? Is it some invisible force then, or because how could we even fight something that we don't know what it is? Because
I don't think it is very invisible. I think the social norms are quite visible. Okay, and they are certainly analyzable. So the social norms around what it is to be a woman, or what it is to be a girl, and what expectations that come with that, I think are quite visible. The attitudes that young girls live under are to be responsible, to take school seriously, to look in a particular way. I think these are norms that we are very familiar with. And those of us who have been around for a while know that they have shifted. And I think that there are, thankfully, more variety, a bit more freedom now compared to when I was a teenager. I think the social costs of not staying in line with what was expected of you as a girl was higher, I think. But I think also there is now, certainly in the lives of young people in our societies today, also a much more individualized ideology around the fact that there is an expectation that we create our own success, and also the auditing society, where we are continually assessed. Certainly in school children are continually assessed. Girls are always expected to take more responsibility for their own personal development. And we know that this creates a lot of mental problems for young women. And I don't think that any of this is really invisible. It can feel invisible when you live in it. But I think that, so when you are a young girl living and trying to navigate in this landscape of expectations, one of those expectations being that it is up to you to create your own happiness. And you are continually assessed on social media, in school, in society generally. It can feel like an overwhelming, monolithic, power structure that you can't do anything about. But from the side, I mean, this is a system of norms that we can analyze. But changing them has to be a collective endeavor.
Yeah, that's what I was going to come to, because obviously the lived experience is then it's not invisible. Then it's very. I mean, sometimes I'm nervous, and when I see young girls on Instagram and such, where it's so prominent that they need to look a certain way, make surgeries to look a certain way. You can see it everywhere. But what scares me is that if we've already had, I mean, the women in the 1920s who fought for that we could go to universities, that we could vote, all these rights that we gained, and still we're somehow still there. That's what is scary for me, because that's what I mean by invisible, because then what do you do? What do you do? If you can't change any more laws, how do you get it more equal? Is it, even if you can analyze
you organize and you act in solidarity. I think that, and I think the one thing which is also sort of the upside of social media is that young people can find friends, or they can find strength in numbers also through social media. So social media is not only bad in that it sort of fosters these crazy ideals about how you should look. It is also a potential to find comrades, and form allegiances. I think it's also empowering in that sense. And I think that young people today, many of them, are much more politically aware than we were when I was in that age. So it's difficult and challenging, but there is hope too. I think.
Yeah, I guess like this continuous conversation and developments leads somewhere. Yeah, so that's interesting that you can see that historical perspective of it, or development. But we're diverging a little bit from what we were going to talk about. But I want to ask you still: are we still back into the conversation of in the 50s when some women said, "But what about us women who want to be housewives, who wants to be mothers, and not everyone wants to stop wearing makeup." So are we back to that conversation again, or is it a similar parallel?
I think that it's interesting that we seem to be always stuck in this question about what a proper woman should be like. And that we don't get away from that. Even when we're talking about liberation, or we still get sucked into that question: how should women live their lives? I think there are, and we see it now also with I think really troubling and infuriating trend among some people who call themselves feminists, also within philosophy, who use feminism as a way to argue, to push a transphobic agenda, which is also grounded in these notions about that there is a proper way to be a woman. and that this womanhood is somehow to be guarded. I think that's something that we seem to never get away from. It sort of manifests itself in different ways, and it has to not only to do with women, but sort of guarding this gender barrier. And we saw that in homophobic arguments 20 years ago, that we now see in transphobic arguments. And it goes back also to concerns that Wollstonecraft had in the 1790s, that we are always concerned with this idea of that there is one proper way to be a woman. And you are not allowed to transgress from that, because we will punish you if you are the wrong kind of woman. And that is a very strongly inhibiting factor, because the social costs are terrible. I mean, the social costs were, Wollstonecraft wrote in the 1790s in a way that many women didn't, but she paid a substantial social cost for that. And it was a way of living which was very difficult and very challenging. And I think that is something that many women still face. That we are still questioned. Even our presence at universities now is questioned, because we are assumed to bring with us some kind of specific female qualities that are, on the one hand, supposedly morally valuable and therefore should be guarded and cannot be transgressed. On the other hand, makes us not quite as good as the proper people. And it just infuriates me. And this is one reason why feminism, as a long tradition of thinking critically about society and about social norms from the point of view of those who do not have the priority of interpretation, is so important. And that is one of the main reasons why it is still important to read Wollstonecraft today.
Oh yeah, nice that you got that in there as well, because I think that was a question I had as well, why we should read her today. So I guess you definitely answered her. She has a lot to say to us.
Yes.
If we shift gear a little bit, just slightly, about education again, and the Swedish academic system and how it's organized. So we know we have this meritocratic system where we get in by merits, presumably. I'm curious, what would Mary Wollstonecraft perhaps say about that system? Is that the best way that we could have equality or equal opportunities in society or in academia?
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, this is a complicated question. I mean, certainly if our point of view now is the university, and getting into university, getting into an education program or to get a job in the university, we pride ourselves on being a meritocratic system. So you bring your academic credentials, and then you get in if your credentials are better than the others. I think that a problem with that, there are several problems with that. I mean, the idea itself is reasonable. But the problem is that this idea of meritocracy is sort of clashes with the reality in which both your capacities for gaining the right kinds of credentials will be dependent upon the circumstances that you live in, your class background, your gender, to what extent you have been encouraged, to what extent you have the self-reliance. So I think that a risk with a meritocratic system, and I'm not the only one who says this, is that we think that the credentials that people bring with them on their certificates or their CVs reflects a fair competition, right? And it doesn't. In an unequal society, no competition is equal. And we know that. I mean, if we look at the composition of people who study and work at Lund University, we will see that it is not representative of what society looks like generally. There is a selection mechanism which is not on your CV, but which happens outside of that. So that's one problem. Another problem is that the norm of the meritocratic system allows for a kind of individualization of responsibility, such that if you fail, if your credentials don't match up, if you're not as good as the others, that must be because you haven't tried hard enough. That must somehow be your own fault. And that is really what that means is that the meritocratic system very easily turns into a kind of aristocratic elite system, which can legitimize itself with the argument that this is a fair competition and you will get in if you win it. But the competition was never fair because the starting positions and the circumstances in which people live are not fair. And also there is an ideology in the meritocratic system which allows those who do get in, those who do win the competition, to say that those who didn't, the ones who are beat, it must be their own fault. Because if it's not their fault, then maybe my merits are not my merits. Maybe I didn't, it's not due to me. Maybe it's luck, or maybe it's inheritance, or maybe it's my rich father, you know. And we don't want that. So there is an ideology in this which creates the impression that this is a fair competition, which is not.
But so that's a fair critique, I think, of meritocracy. But could you ever see, if we had a fair society, like given that somehow it's fair, could our own interests and our own cultural investment, because we are different in how we, so could if we, given that that's fair, would the meritocratic system in that case be a good way to measure our skills? And
yes, I mean, so meritocracy in itself,
the ideal
depending on the context, can be perfectly reasonable if the context is right. We don't want a meritocratic system for healthcare, you know, that you need to prove yourself as the best kind of patient in order to get in. But fair enough, in the university system, a meritocratic system certainly presents itself as a viable selection mechanism. The problem with it are the ones that I just said, that the ideology that comes with it, that people are their own creators of success, and that the conditions for gaining credentials, for gaining merits, is unequal. So certainly if society was completely equal, then, you know, fair enough. But since it's not, it will continue to be a problem. And I don't know what the alternative system will be, but I think it is important that we have a realization of the fact that our system is flawed, and that we need to take that into account when we assess people who want to get in. And also the fact that the kind of credentials that we value in academia is quite narrow. So that is also something that we continually need to discuss. What is a credible merit if you want to get into university? What kind of capacities do we want to value? And that ultimately, of course, is what kind of university do we want? Do we want a white male university of privileged people who think that they are the best in the world, but maybe it's just due to luck and circumstance? Is that the kind of university that we want? Or do we want to have an inclusive university where we get a variety of people a fair chance? Then in that case, we need to look at how we assess and how we vet people who want to get in.
Indeed, good questions to ask ourselves. Lena, I have so many other questions to ask you. I think we can go on all day, limited by time. Maybe I can ask you about your little bit about your other project, or just a quick one. So you also do this, or maybe you can just tell us a little bit about it and then round up about this cashless system, how that affects injustices in society, because it's something that you're working on.
Okay,
as well.
So I have a new research project which sort of ties in with my interest that I've just been talking about. You know, how we look at, as philosophers, how we look at society from the point of view of people without privilege, and what does unfairness and unfreedom look like if we try to look at it from that point of view. So I'm interested in economic justice, and the current project that I'm starting up is about our transition towards a cashless payment system or a cashless economy. For most of us, it is perfectly normal now that we don't use cash money at all. We pay with our credit card or we pay with our smartphones. But what we often perhaps don't think about is that still a substantial portion of the population live largely cash-dependent lives. And if you are dependent on cash, likelihood is that you are economically vulnerable, because the cash dependence is linked to poverty. So the poorer you are, the more cash dependent you will be for various reasons. Maybe you can't afford to buy a smartphone, maybe you can't afford to keep it updated, maybe you don't even have a bank account, so you can't have a credit card. So there are many aspects like that makes it a fact that the most economically vulnerable people in society are also those who live with cash dependence. And when a society like the Swedish one very quickly transcends over into a cashless economy, what that in effect will mean is that the most economically vulnerable groups will be locked out of the official economy, and they will be dependent not only on cash, but they will be dependent upon an unofficial economy where cash is still usable. And we can see that this is also a consequence of the COVID pandemic, that has also accelerated this process. So more and more stores and cafes and public services no longer accept cash. And for most of us that doesn't matter. But if you go around town and look in stores and cafes, you will see these signs everywhere. Cash is not accepted. And if cash is the only money you have, increasingly you can't pay. You can't make purchases. Even if you have the money, your money is the wrong kind of money. You can't buy a bus ticket. And that will look and sort of present itself as a quite serious economic injustice only if you look at it from that point of view. Right. This is a cross-disciplinary project which has a component of philosophizing about economic justice from the point of view of lack of privilege, but also an empirical study where we will talk to people who live with cash dependence and also organizations who work with people who live in cash dependence in order to see what it is like for them, the experience of this kind of unfreedom, and what would help them. So that they tell us that rather than we try to think that out for ourselves.
Very interesting project, and I'm looking forward to follow it to see how it develops. Thank you so much for being on the channel and talking
Thank you very
today.
much.
Thank you.